Thank you, Honorable Speaker. The Kurdish people are a highly organized, highly developed, ethnically homogenous group that have been historically oppressed and denied their right to a homeland of their own. They have shown their capacity to be a valuable ally to members of the West, and this House would support empowering the Kurds by giving them or supporting the establishment of a Kurdish state. Our model is that this Kurdish state would be made largely out of lands that are currently under effective Kurdish control. This includes large swaths of northern Iraq. We would give them the full sovereignty and independence of any nation, which would give them international representation to the United Nations. It would give them sovereignty and the rights to self-governance and taxation and such. We don't want this model to be picky about where it's going to go. We think it's a good thing to have it given some broad strokes on that. So I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, how the Kurds are an excellent candidate people to have a state. They have a principal right to it and practical ability to manage it. Secondly, how this dramatically benefits the stability. Sure.
Where there are border disputes or there are relatively like 50-50 mixed populations, who and how would you determine where those borders would be drawn?
To the best that we can. We support the establishment of a Kurdish state largely in northern Iraq. We're not going to have a committee on this. Okay, benefits to the Kurdish people, how this buttresses their strength as a nation, and how this has regional benefits to the West. So the actor here is the West ought to support it and support the creation, as they did with Israel. So firstly, principal right to a state. The Kurdish people have a deep history in these lands. They've been there for generations, they know it. They currently have a functional self-government that they operate in areas of northern Iraq. They have an established civil service, they have leaders, they have internal politics. All of these negotiate with other international actors like the Iraqi government. Secondly, they have a very developed military. The Kurdish Peshmerga is one of the most efficient fighting forces in the world, and they have shown their ability to act independently from other states to achieve solid goals, especially in their fight against ISIS and cooperations with the United States. And lastly, they are an ethnically homogenous group, which suggests that if we were to form a state, it would be relatively stable. It has also been a large part of Kurdish nationalism, a rhetoric that is very, very deeply imbued in the people, and is a very critical goal for these people to feel as though they are legitimate actors in this field. Okay, so that's why they should have it, and why they could have it, and why it would be. Why is it beneficial to Kurds to have it? Firstly, the satisfaction of a drive for a state, right? Very often we see that minority ethnic populations that live as minorities on lands that have historically been theirs feel as though they are being oppressed by their governments, feel as though they do not belong to the land, and feel as though they have a right to the state which is not being fulfilled. Firstly, it gives them a great deal of solace and compensation for the harms that have been done to them to have a state. It's a good thing. Secondly, they have sovereignty and protection. The Kurds have historically been oppressed by majority groups in the territories which they occupy. They are frequently the victims of violence in areas such as Turkey. They are oppressed by Iraqis. They are oppressed by Shias, particularly now, given that the Iraqi government is controlled largely by a Shia majority. They exist as minorities, and because they don't have a state, because they have no right to defend themselves, because they are citizens of these countries, they are subject to poor treatment and have no ability to defend themselves. Go ahead.
So which one is it? Do they have their own state and live as a functional people, or are they dispersed in Iraq and face constant discrimination, as you say?
They are currently, so they exist in Iraq, they are also in Turkey, they are disparate. We would like to take lands which are currently controlled and create a home for other Kurds. We think that they will migrate to their homeland as many of the dispersed Jews would when Israel was created, because you have a state that is created and run by the Kurdish people that they know will defend their interests and protect them from oppression, which they have experienced historically. It is a good thing. Lastly, they have control over oil revenues, right? We would give them land, there would be value here, they would have the ability to, say, generate wealth for their people. And lastly, they would not be dependent on the Iraqi government or the Turkish government for funding and for self-governance. Because keep in mind, now the Kurds operating within Iraq do currently have regional autonomy and self-representation, but this is because it has been given to them by Iraq. As Iraqi citizens, they are still subject to the will of Baghdad. And given that the government of Baghdad is increasingly moving towards a Shia majority, where the Kurds are Sunni, there is a high chance, and there's very volatile, that the Kurds might have their powers taken away from them. They could, at any day, have their region infringed upon, they could have their powers taken away, they could have their funding cut. They are essentially held hostage by the governments to which they are a part. This is harmful for several reasons. One, it doesn't allow them for any long-term planning. They cannot invest in infrastructure, they cannot develop a state, they can have no certainty that they will be able to control the lands in which they currently live in times to come. This dramatically stymies their ability to exist as a people, as a functional state. We think that this will increase their ability to be stable. And also just make them feel as though they are safe and have a home. It's very oppressive to live unsure as to whether or not you will have the rights over the land that you currently occupy. Yes?
So the establishment of Israel also meant rising anti-Semitism in states where those Jews chose not to actually move to Israel. What do you think would happen for people who choose not to leave Turkey, that have linguistic, cultural, or differences that keep them from moving to this new Kurdistan?
Yeah, sure. It might not be great for them, but they continue to be oppressed in the status quo, right? We think it would be better to give them an option to move there and assimilate with their culturally homogenous people. We think generally the creation of Israel was a good thing for Jews, right? So we're happy with that and happy to do something similar again. Okay. So what is the benefit to the West to having an empowered, stable, self-defending Kurdish state? Firstly, this reduces tension in other areas of the world where Kurds currently exist. So in Turkey, there is often violence by Kurdish nationalist movements that are fighting for a state. In Iraq, there is often violence by Kurdish rebel factions that are looking for an autonomous state. All of these nationalist actions and movements would likely be stymied by the creation of a Kurdish state, reducing the violence that happens in these kind of volatile areas of the world, and giving a reason for, say, increased stability. Just a second, you can speak in a minute. Okay. Secondly, we think that the Kurds would be a strong ally for the West. The Kurds have shown their commitment to lining up against common enemies of the West in their fight against ISIS and their alignment against Iran. Currently, it's difficult to negotiate with the Kurds because you have to do it through Baghdad. You can't negotiate directly with it. You don't have permission from the Kurds to, say, put troops on their soil or to cooperate in military operations. It's difficult. If you have an established state, a sovereign state, then you can make these kinds of arrangements. And perhaps in several years you have a military base in Kurdistan, or perhaps you have, say, a regional ally that is able to help you in your endeavors. An example of this was when the Yazidi Christians were facing genocide by ISIS. The Kurdish Peshmerga cooperated with the United States to create a humanitarian corridor to allow United States people to evacuate the Yazidi. This is an example of the benefits of having an ally in the region, similar to the benefits that Israel presents. I think that Kurdistan, given their alignment and their past experience of helping the United States and the West, would be a valuable ally to have, and we should buttress them by giving them sovereignty, by giving them the ability to grow, and by giving the Kurdish people a safe haven that they deserve and have had entitlements to for generations. We are very proud of people.
Thanks, time Mr. for speech. I'll invite the leader of the opposition to take
Madam Speaker, while we recognize that the Kurdish autonomous region in Iraq already exists as a quasi-state of independence, we think actively trying and funding or supporting a separatist movement in Kurdistan alienates one of our most important allies in the region, which is Turkey, creates two unstable states, e.g. Iraq, which is left with no economic oil resources, and Kurdistan, which is dependent on those oil resources, given the kind of prices of oil we see, and in future creates massive tensions within the region, especially with Kurds who live within Turkey and cannot move or cannot seem to move to Kurdistan. However, my rebuttals will be integrated, but one thing that stands out. But the thing that you talked about, the principal reason of why we should give them a state, was rather actually not principal, like functional reasons or why they can exist as a state. Like, firstly, we don't recognize that as the reason for why we give statehood, right? Economic independence or the ability to exist as a state doesn't always mean that you ought to give someone a state. But we think that if it tries to assume practical consequences is the reason why we should give states, then practical consequences should be the metric by which we should judge whether or not these people ought to have a state to begin with. Because the first thing I'm going to talk about, what does Kurdistan actually look like, right? And I think the Prime Minister did a really good job telling us what it actually looks like. It does actually now exist as a largely autonomous region, right? The fact that they have self-governance, they have control over their taxes and their oil revenues, right? They have oil sharing agreements which exist with the central Iraqi states. They have free migration between Iraq and Kurdistan, where the Kurds can move to Kurdistan and set up base there, right? They have an autonomous army which is trained, right? We think most of the benefits that exist as an independent state already exist for Kurdistan, but we think actively supporting a separatist movement antagonizes Turkey for no actual practical benefit to the Kurdish people. We think those benefits exist already. The characterization PM gave you kind of serves into that argument to begin with. First, why do we create bad outcomes for both these states economically? We think the economic outcomes of separating Kurdistan from Iraq has disastrous consequences on both these nations. What happens currently now is Kurdistan holds most of Iraq's oil, for which the revenue sharing happens with the Iraqi government, or they pipe that oil to central Iraq to make Iraq energy independent. In return, the Iraqi government gives them other resources like agriculture, which comes mainly from southern and central Iraq, and gives them things like central funding in instances where oil prices cannot support them. That's what happened recently, right? When oil prices fell by half in 1 month, the Kurdish reserves were down to almost zero, and they needed the Iraqi central help to try and support them. So in a world, we should create a Kurdistan which depends on only oil, which cuts off Iraq's central economic supply, not only has massively bad consequences for both their economic independence, but also creates a state which is extremely unstable. Like the point at which you take a nation state which already has massive disputes, right? Even though you said northern Iraq is completely Kurdish, there are large Sunni populations who live in that region. That's why autonomy has been a large question for the central Iraqi government. It becomes excessively hard to draw those boundaries, right? And the moment you draw the boundaries and give a large number of resources to Kurdistan, as he talks about, you create two unstable states, both deprived of different kind of resources, who continue to try and fight over those borders, Madam Speaker. You create a largely unstable region, replacing one which is largely stable in a world where cooperation already exists. How does it impact the fight against ISIS, right? We think Iraqi forces have largely been shown to be ineffective against ISIS. That's why, for example, the West has continuously supported the Peshmerga rebels and the Kurdish forces. But the problem that we've seen with the Kurdish forces recently was the fact that they only defended the Kurdish people, right? In fact, they held up only their regions and cover their boundaries, not actually engaging with the Iraqi militaries. What we ought to be doing is to make conditional giving weapons to try and force Kurdish forces to engage with the Iraqi military and support them. Not create a state where they can draw their own boundaries, put their men and protect Kurdish forces, given the fact that the only actors in the region who are capable of using those weapons effectively, but a state where they have a vested interest in the region, where we can push them to central Iraq and try and make things like conditional arms transfer to try and help their fight against ISIS. You think it becomes far worse when the only capable individuals who can use these weapons against the threat that the West wants to fight are now given their own state and given solid boundaries that they can defend and are no longer given those conditions. What is your Turkish presence in the region? This is extremely important. Before that, I'll take you behind.
Yeah, sure. So with economic interdependence, don't you know that nations can trade? Like, it's not like if we establish these boundaries that there will be no relationships between Nanyang and Kurdistan.
At the point at which there are already massive differences between people of two regions, where you've literally fought away a state for one which could not have existed because of the kind of differences of those people, where there are massive conflicts regarding boundaries and antagonism amongst individuals about a certain group taking away resources, it becomes exceptionally hard for you to trade. I'll give you the example of India and Pakistan, for example, who literally be massively good allies economically, but do refuse to do so because of massive border disputes and the feeling of antagonism between the people within. Trade becomes exceptionally unlikely in those instances. What does it do to Turkish presence in the region, Madam Speaker? Because in a world in which we recognize the benefits to the Kurdish people exist already in a world in which an autonomous state exists, as Prime Minister characterized to you, we think it's exceptionally problematic when the West is seen as propping up a state which Turkey cannot seem to try and engage with. You've seen the fact that battle against Kurdistan or the involvement of Kurdish minorities has been the central focal point of Turkish politics in the last decade, right? The fact that recently the Kurdish PKK has actually given up the claim to statehood in favor of power sharing within Turkey indicates a shift towards acceptance of Kurdish minorities in Turkey, right? You've seen Kurdish minorities within Turkey give up their right to sovereignty to try and engage with Turkish populations and get some sort of help in those regions. What does it do, right? We think it clearly kills incentive and puts Turkey in a ball of uncertainty when the largest Western allies are seen as propping up propping up the Kurdish state, which they cannot see to exist at their borders, Madam Speaker. The one which you give them weapons, you give them recognition in the UN, you give them resources, is a one which you antagonize Turkey, and that's problematic. Why is that problematic, Madam Speaker? Why is Turkey even important? The first thing we will say is Turkey has already been hesitant in trying to engage against ISIS, right? Even though they joined the coalition against ISIS, they refused to give things like arms because they're worried about Kurdish forces using those arms against them. In a world in which the Western powers are seen as propping up a state which has the ability to try and direct those efforts against Turkey and has gone against everything Turkey stood for, you antagonize Turkey with no reason. Why is Turkey important? Madam Speaker, Turkey is probably one of the only nominal democracies which exists in the Middle East, right? One of the only countries which continuously seek to engage with the Western world in trying to use their army bases against ISIS, for example. They've been one of our strongest military allies in the region, where they constantly help Western forces, for example, like use their airstrips for the kind of airstrikes that you saw on ISIS, right? We do not think antagonizing your most powerful democratic ally in the region is something that you ought to engage in, especially in a world where you want their cooperation to try and get the aims you want. Yes.
if you want to check against Erdogan's increasingly totalitarian tendencies, don't you want to remove the biggest boogeyman he has in the PKK?
Okay, firstly we will say the trends are actually the opposite. The PKK has given up the right to autonomy, trying to engage with Erdogan, who's become more moderate in terms of trying to share power with them. But secondly, what happens to Turkish people within Turkey, right? Because that's something that closing opposition talks to you about. We think in a world in which there exist large Kurdish populations who already haven't moved away from Turkey, right? Assuming that the Kurdistan was as autonomous as he talks about, it's quite likely that those Turkish Kurds would already have moved to Kurdistan. The fact that they do not move or cannot move indicates fundamental incapability of them shifting away from their livelihood, for example, or leaving their jobs or historical ties within Turkey to move to Kurdistan. So in a world in which you actually do create a Kurdish state, you make it exceptionally hard for Kurdish minorities within Turkey to exist as a people and to give it any respect. In a world in which the Turkish government can literally say, you could just move over, right? Or a world in which the large Turkish majorities who are already fundamentally opposed to the creation of a Kurdish state can now say that you ought to be second-class citizens or you can just move across the border. You only heighten it as discrimination, Madam Speaker, in a world in which you create a state and give an excuse to Turkish authoritarianism or give an excuse to Turkish people to say we ought not care about the right of the Kurds. The Kurds exist as an autonomous people already. We do not think engaging them or supporting our separatist movement is beneficial for the region, is beneficial for Turkey's involvement, is beneficial for the Kurdish people who cannot leave Turkey, extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for their speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to take part.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I want to talk about two things in constructive that will directly deal with this point we get from opposition that, look, they're autonomous anyway, what are the benefits of this policy? Despite the fact that the Kurdish people in Iraq live in a state of semi-autonomous control over their region, there are a number of distinct benefits of this policy that Joe has already talked about that I want to expand on. First, the idea that they are no longer dependent to the same degree on the whims and the political fortunes of the central government in Baghdad. Haider al-Abadi's governing coalition is 56% Shia. This is actually more than his predecessor, al-Maliki, who was generally considered a Shia extremist, who was much more concerned with benefits to his own sect of Islam as opposed to spreading these benefits to other minorities and other people within Iraq, such as the Kurds. His government coalition is even more skeptical of decentralization to the regions than his predecessor. What this means is the current status quo of governance in Iraq is a particularly tenuous one for the Kurds, where the autonomy they talk about is more likely than ever to be rescinded, not in totality obviously, but in a sliding scale that means that Kurdistan is likely to lose control over several important powers. One extremely important example of this is oil revenue. Currently, a major source of contention between the central government regions is over exploration and development contracts for oil companies, and whether or not Kurdistan gets to allocate them on their own, or whether or not the central government has veto power over the kinds of companies who enter that region. The problem is that in a situation of uncertainty, the continuing ability of the Kurds to control as basic an aspect of who is allowed to do business within their borders is not certain. Not only is this a problem for the economic prospects of the region, not only is this a problem for their self-control, it is in a self-fulfilling prophecy way bad for business because of the uncertainty that exists over who controls that critical aspect of giving contracts. That means that the control that exists right now in the status quo, while, no thank you, it does cover several important powers, is an uncertain one, and that is unacceptable. Next, on regional alliances, Joe talks to you about why an independent Kurdish state could be an extremely useful regional ally for the West. He talks to you about the goodwill you build up when youth in the region and leaders in the region have seen the West and international organizations pushing and advocating for them to have a stake. But there's a second reason why I think it makes them better allies. In the status quo, governing leaders and politicians of the Kurdish regional government have to balance competing considerations when assessing how to cooperate both with Iraq and international actors. Given that they face a domestic population clamoring for independence, there's an immediate check on the degree to which they can cooperate without having something to show for it in return. There's an immediate check to the extent to which they can help the West and the extent to which they can help Iraq before the question comes about what those people they're helping are doing to assist them in their drive for statehood. Allowing for statehood and the needs of the people to be met makes politicians more likely to assist us and more able to navigate their own domestic politics to be able to help us as well. Let's talk about the opposition case. The first thing they tell you is that principled reasons ought just be secondary to practical considerations in this debate. We think they both should be important. That while it is important to understand what the practical consequences of such a state might be, when we are dealing with an oppressed population that has been systematically denied the right to statehood for decades, I think that both ought to factor in to how we look at this draft. On their practical considerations. The first one about Turkey. There are a number of reasons why I don't think this will have the impact on Turkey that opposition is concerned about. First, I don't think opening opposition understands the relationship that actually exists between Turkey and the Kurdish regional government in Iraq specifically. The two actors are actually on quite good terms. The reason for that is Turkey has a number of incentives to cooperate with the Kurdish regional government in Iraq. First, energy independence. Second, that it delegitimizes PKK violence within their borders when they're seen as cooperating and acting in alliance with a Kurdish force abroad. And third, it gives them increased leverage over Iran, because there's now a majority Sunni state within Iraq, a state they're concerned about falling excessively within Iranian control. There are a number of reasons why in the status quo, Turkey has incentives to cooperate with the KRG. That's why they recently allowed a pipeline to exist directly between Kurdistan and Turkey, bypassing the Iraqi central government. The incentives they talk about Turkey being really pissed off simply don't exist. Second, their situation with the PKK, as they identify themselves, has to a degree been lowering in tension, and given the recent power sharing agreement and the renunciation of a claim to statehood. That is what's most likely to piss Turkey on. It's unclear why they'd have such a visceral reaction to a Kurdish state being given to in northern Iraq. And third, Turkey's current situation in regards to international actors like ISIS makes them particularly dependent on Western alliances as well. The things they talk about Turkey's importance in fighting ISIS cut both ways given the geographical proximity of ISIS to Turkey. It makes it also dependent on Western alliances. I think this is a potential harm that does not exist, and in any case is not as important as the other things we've identified. The next big actor they talk about is Iraq and oil. They say that Iraq currently provides a lot of this aid to Kurdistan. This will lead to two states being created that are both deprived. Well, the immediate thing that comes to mind is if there now will be two states that are both deprived in the resources they both need, the chances of trade agreements continuing between them seem quite high. Because to a degree, these kind of considerations are borne out by practical realities. These are two groups that have already been in opposition to each other for a long period of time. Despite the ethnic differences and the regional differences, and the existence of a claim to statehood for a long time, practical considerations and the influence of private actors like oil companies, I'll take you in 1 second, are the kinds of things that drive maintaining these trade relations and mean that they're likely to persist for longer. I'll take closing.
So why would Iraq see this preferential access to oil that they have when the Kurdish people are part of the larger state?
Why would they see a preferential access to oil when the Kurdish people are part of the larger state? I mean, it's possible they're still given access to oil in Kurdistan. You're going to have to expand that more in your speech and hopefully let us respond to it when you do. The important thing to note here, though, is that part of supporting the establishment of a state also presumably would mean temporarily filling in any sort of funding gap that Kurdistan experiences if Iraq is to pull back any sort of assistance from them. That's a gap we're willing to fill in the short term as part of us supporting the establishment of the state. They then hear about ISIS and why we need the Peshmerga to particularly focus on combating ISIS in support of the Iraqi army. Why would they do that in opposition's world? Why is it an incentive in the status quo to come to the aid of Baghdad and come to the aid of Iraq? The most likely situation where that happens is where the West, having increased leverage over them and increased goodwill with them, is able to direct them to fight the ISIS forces in Iraq. Currently, the allocation of forces mostly to Syria is something that I don't think opposition has any mechanism changing on their side of the house. We then hear briefly about discrimination, about people who can't leave. It's true that not all people who are Kurdish will be able to leave and join the state. Many more will than on opposition side of the house. Importantly, the status quo faced by Kurds in other parts of the world is one of systemic discrimination. It is one where they're forced into situations where they're marginalized and oppressed. It is unclear what qualitative or quantitative difference happens when an independent state is established, except for the fact that there is now a place for them to move, and second, as we've identified, an incentive for actors to actually cooperate with that state, an incentive for Turkey to cooperate with that state, to be seen as on good ties with them, which makes the region safer and is better for Kurdish people as well. Thank you.
Right, I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her speech and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to take the floor.
I'm going to cover 4 questions in my speech. The first is on whether there's a principled right to a state and whether that matters. Second, what Kurdistan today looks like. Thirdly, on Kurds worldwide or in Turkey and Iraq. Lastly, on the response or likely response of Iraq and Turkey. To the first question then. So, I think we can all agree that there is a potential for there to exist some principled right to a state. The problem in this debate is I don't think we've heard any arguments for why that principled right should exist. Because the arguments we actually hear from the opening government are functional reasons. They are arguments like there exists a national character, there exists a government, and there exists an army. These things put together are not neither necessary, probably necessary, but certainly not sufficient reasons to say there is a principled right for a group of people to exist together and be a state. So, as someone with Taiwanese heritage, I think I'd be quite clear in saying that perhaps there is a principled right for Taiwan to exist as a state, but to the extent to which Taiwan's declaration declaring its independence as a state, or people supporting that, might be bad for people in Taiwan because that might limit their freedoms in some way, limit their freedoms to live or express themselves economically in some way, then I think the question becomes predicated on whether declaring independence for Kurdistan is a good thing for the Kurdish people. Because I'm not sure we have ever heard in this debate clear articulations of why the decision to be free matters above and beyond the ability to decide politically and economically your own future. So that brings me to the second question, which is what Kurdistan looks like in today's world. We think it's clear that there probably exists, so both teams in opening agree that there is a degree of autonomy that exists in the status quo. To that extent, we already have military cooperation with the United States. So we don't think that's likely to change very much, like in the event of Kurdistan declaring independence. We think that happens both directly between tribal leaders and the United States, and it also happens directly between the United States government and the government of Iraq, which is already a US ally. We're not sure why Kurdistan is going to gain more mileage out of being able to work directly with the United States. The claims that we hear on why these current autonomous states of Kurdistan is not enough for individual Kurds are threefold. Firstly, we're told that they're politically oppressed and that they have less sovereignty over their own actions vis-a-vis being independent. That's obviously true, like to the extent to which they don't have full sovereignty and can't decide what they want. What they miss out on the other hand is what Mitra tells you, that exists in a quid pro quo and an exchange of resources with the rest of Iraq. And that's something that's likely to be diminished in the event of an unfriendly withdrawal or cessation of ties with the Iraqi government, which is not likely to see this as a friendly move. So if the Iraqi government trades off taking some of Kurdistan's oil revenue, or the existing states of Kurdistan's oil revenues, for trading them agriculture and other things that make that part of Kurdistan less dependent on the price of oil, that is a good thing that we don't think they've been entirely unequivocal about. That says always a separation of Kurdistan from the Iraqi Republic is always likely to lead to antagonism, and that was always likely to mean that sort of beneficial economic relations that exist between the other parts of Iraq and Kurdistan would be reduced. The next thing we hear then is that they live in political uncertainty because they cannot decide their fate. That is a strange claim on face value, because presumably all of us in this room live in some degree of political uncertainty with regards to the political process of who will be elected as the next senator or the next president or the next head of state. So we're uncertain why that matters in a democracy. Presumably also democracies are, to the extent to which Iraq is a functional democracy, quite good at providing information about who is likely to be elected, and that is a degree of certainty to which individual Kurds can operate under. In a moment, I'll take back half. But the point here is that's unlikely to change even if Kurdistan and Kurds get their own republic, because if Kurdistan is to be democratic, you operate under the same degree of uncertainty on who is going to be elected or not. So we're not sure why Kurds get more certainty just because the politicians arguing for office are all Kurdish as opposed to non-Kurdish. But before I go on,
You concede that Kurdistan controls oil revenues to a significant degree in the status quo.
Yes.
Why won't Iraq re-invade and re-control those regions as they've done in the past when they had the military ability to do so in the future?
So we think that's far more likely to happen on your side of the house, where you have an unfriendly withdrawal from Iraq in the status quo. Presumably, in the current arrangements, Iraq has an incentive to maintain the internal stability of that governing coalition and to continue to receive the sort of United States support that holds Iraq together in the first place. That's an outcome far worse on your side of the house. The last thing I'm going to say about certainty is, to the extent to which Iraq has incentives to maintain some form of non-majoritarian rule over its minorities, we think that's far less likely to happen when Kurdistan leaves, obviously because, if Kurdistan leaves the Iraqi Republic, then presumably the minority bargaining position within the Iraqi parliament is lessened, because now you have less minorities who that Iraqi coalition government needs to care for. That means that's likely to be a worse world within Iraq as well. The next question then is what happens to Kurds in Turkey or in Iraq. Because if we accept that it benefits politically to Kurds, given their current state of autonomy, are likely to be marginal at best, then we think a lot of the impacts of their model happen when people move from outside the homeland to within the homeland. So we're told that Turkish Kurds or Iraqi Kurds rather are going to move from their homes to this new homeland of Kurdistan. We think that's problematic because firstly, we think a lot of these people are going to be unable to move. It's not entirely analogous to the formation of Israel, where there is like a significant degree of international funding for Jews all over the world to move to that state, and also a greater acceptance of or decline in anti-Semitism over the world. Because we think a lot of these people are going to be stuck according to economic circumstance. They're going to be now condemned as not Turkish or not Iraqi far more than they already are in the status quo. So the situation of people who are left behind is far worse. We also think what they do is they force people to make a choice. Because if you choose to stay behind, that's in a moment, if you choose to stay behind, then it's far more likely that you are discriminated against, and you now have to choose between that twin identity as to be a Kurd or a Turk. Yes?
Yeah, but the comparison is that in the status quo, if they're facing the discrimination under status quo, they have no choice and no ability to even consider that. The mere existence of a choice does not mean it is illegitimate.
So they don't, it's true, they don't have the ability to consider an alternative state, but they do have the ability to agitate for their political rights within that state, which is far more likely to happen when that state does not fear the insurrection of a separatist entity. And that brings me to the last question, what happens with Iraq and Turkey? We think it's clear that Turkey is going to react quite violently for a very obvious reason, that even though the formation of Kurdistan on its doorstep is something that they've been pretty happy to deal with right now, that is all only true because there is no declaration of independence. Turkey deeply fears a Kurdish declaration of independence because the independence of areas of northern Turkey suggests also for Kurds within Turkey who have equal claims to land within Turkey to make that same declaration of independence, because one action legitimizes the other. The Turkish government is going to put that as an interest above and beyond the interests of US alliances, which means all the harms of Turkey drawing back from its combat against ISIS are going to happen. We think Iraq and Turkey are always going to have twin incentives to continue harming the new state of Kurdistan because of the antagonistic way in which it withdraws. That's why that state will never be tenable. That's why Kurds will never have a better life. Proud to oppose.
Thank the deputy leader for his speech and invite the member of government.
Panel, let's be clear what actually matters with respect to Kurdistan. It is the creation of long-term stability in the region and the short-term means to accomplish that stability. What we're going to bring to you in extension is much deeper analysis about exactly what the characteristics of a long-run stable region is and how that can be achieved, and secondarily what the impediments in the short term are to that stability and how we uniquely solve for them. So before that, just one piece of extraneous rebuttal that's not going to be integrated into things. So what we hear from opening opposition is that there's a distinct problem with the Kurdish minorities who continue to exist in other places. Now, firstly, we do agree with opening government that fewer individuals being oppressed is generally a good thing. But when they talk about the notion that many people can't move, I think this belies the reality that wealthy Kurdish individuals, as wealthy Jews, have an incentive, that is to say, to fund other individuals who want to engage in the diaspora and want to move to do that. Also, given the relatively short distances involved in the distance between many Kurdish populations and the eventual Kurdistan, I don't think this will be much of a problem. What they really rest their hat on here is the notion that agitation for rights within other nations, particularly Turkey, creates a more effective solution on their side of the house. The problem with that is that they don't understand that the very presence of a threat is often the crucial impediment to successful extension of rights to the persecuted minority. That is to say, when there's continual tensions with a stronger PKK, there is a less sympathetic population within Turkey to extend rights and to extend protections to the Kurdish minority. A smaller Kurdish population in Turkey fundamentally poses a smaller threat to the population of Turkey and weakens fundamentally the PKK's strength in the region, causing more incentive for Turkey to extend rights and protections to individual minorities living in their state. We think similar analysis would exist in other places. So thank you. So, first point of extension. How do we create long-term stability, and what are the conditions of that? I want to separate that first within Iraq itself, and secondly outside of it. We get a question from opening opposition. Given that they currently have some degree of autonomy, who cares about the creation of an independent state? Well, what we tell you is there's a unique and particular situation now that has not existed in the past and is crucial to the creation of stability, which is that Kurdistan, for the first time in modern era, has a military superiority as well as a long-run resource superiority to the Iraqi state. That is to say, the Peshmerga is currently in in a better position to defend against an Iraqi attack than at any other time, but the oil interest that would normally preclude them from being able to access future benefits doesn't exist. Why is this important? Because a creation of an independent Kurdistan right now creates a situation of peace and space to maintain control of their own lands. We think the likely alternative that they see in their side of the house, as was seen in the early 90s, is a massive re-expansion into the region whenever the current conflict dies down, whenever the Iraqi state again maintains a larger military and a more powerful military. We think the problem with that is that they're effectively baking in a future civil war or civil conflict within their side of the house, insofar as there remains the incentive to repossess those very oil fields that are so lucrative, also given that oil prices will likely rise by that point. There's even greater incentive. We, on the other hand, allow a new independent Kurdish state, create the breathing space and deterrent space to ensure that the Iraqi government doesn't have that incentive to create that new oppression and to create that reinvasion. Sure.
In a world where oil prices have slumped and are likely to remain so, do you think it's super easy for Iraq and Turkey to try and get together and make the new Kurdistan an economic prior, so they can, before oil prices can ever rise, to try and exclude them from international trade and existing as nations?
I think it would be incredibly difficult given the West's interest in a Kurdistan being independent and strong. I think absolute economic isolation would be A, impractical, given allies within the region and the sorts of border flows that could exist, but secondarily would run afoul of their short-term interest I'm going to get to in my second point of extension in terms of the battle against ISIS. So, given that's the case, we think that Iraq itself is far better off on our side of the house. Also, we think that the inevitable Shia domination creates a secondary burden with them underneath this before I move on to the second element of the long-run stability. That is to say, the Shia majority is fundamentally, as opening government correctly characterized, likely to be permanent. There is not sufficient numbers of Kurds and Sunnis to ever create a political situation where the Shia power base can be checked. That creates an incentive for Shia politicians and leaders to always and only care about what their domestic political constituency cares about. We say that very often is not persecuting the Kurds or not engaging with geopolitical risk for Iraq. No. So also Turkey in the long run, briefly. So they say some interesting things about Erdogan moderating that I just don't think are true in the status quo. I think if anything he's become more conservative and more dictatorial over the last 5 years. But regardless of that characterization, what we uniquely do is empower the left and empower liberal factions within Turkey to oppose the enormous oppression of Kurds within the region by weakening that movement, as I talked about before. Secondly, what's the impediment to that long run? How do we create the short-term path to that long-run stability? So obviously it's the case that it would be better if there were not tensions between Kurdish groups and other national forces, and this would create by creating an independent Kurdistan. But the problem in the status quo is indeed the fight against ISIS. That is to say, we want to explore the question of how can you defeat ISIS and create the path to that long-run stability. 3 things underneath this. First, why is it the case that the Peshmerga is fundamentally stronger and Iraq is unable, even with Western support, to engage in a successful fight against ISIS? So, first of all, they just simply have more funding and more training. They are a more effective military force, and history actually matters when you talk about military forces, talk about the number of years of training people have. Secondly, desertion and lack of control and command control in the Iraqi army is a problem. Often, up to half of all individuals on the military payroll are not currently reporting to duty within Iraq, and are often actively fighting for Sunni militias, given their allegiances and affiliations. But thirdly, the Shia irregular militias that have stepped in to fill the void left by the Iraqi military have created a bad taste in the mouth of all the peoples that they attempt to fight against, because they're not particularly popular, given that they can engage in awful atrocities against the populations that they advance. So, secondly underneath this, why is it impossible to strengthen the Peshmerga to defeat ISIS on their side of the house? Why is independence crucial? 3 reasons. First of all, on their side of the house, insofar as they presumably want something of a stable Iraq, they need to keep Kurdistan within Iraq in the medium to long run. But that means having some incentive for the central government to be willing to work with us and not view the resource shift as creating an independent Kurdistan, which limits the amount of resources we can fund the second flow. Secondly, there's massive domestic political opposition within the West to engaging in more of this, insofar as there's a great degree of individuals who have ties and sympathies with the current regime. Thirdly, there's a massive undermining on their side of the house of Iran sanctions and other interests that the West has. Why is this the case? Because the central government, having Shia ties with Iran, often seizes shipments of goods into Kurdistan, or attempts to take resources, or at least takes the resources that they can gain access to, which means shipping more resources to Kurdistan on their side of the house is much more difficult, and independent Kurdistan cracks on the ability of the central government to do that. So, why does defeating ISIS matter? Why is the fact that we can give more resources to the Peshmerga and make them a more effective fighting force to more quickly defeat ISIS really matter? So, first of all, we reduce the risk of conflict and re-entry for the West. We say a stronger ISIS and an ISIS that has more power within Iraq is more likely to trigger a response from the West that goes from bombing campaigns to possibly boots on the ground, something that we think is obviously something that you want to avoid. Secondly, the abandonment of allies. Your ability to, for instance, have a Kurdistan that in the medium to long run is sympathetic to you, or a Turkey that in the medium to long run is sympathetic to you, depends on not having a massive ISIS state in the middle of the region. We say there's very little reason to think that they would have Western support if the very thing that the West is supposed to guarantee, which is their own safety and security is not actually being backed up by the West. We are very, very proud to oppose.
I think we have a vote for speech, and I think member of the opposition.
Honorable Speaker, what has been lacking in this round and will be brought to you by closing opposition is a clear narrative of how actually the creation of this state would be disastrous, and even if they could create this state, the fundamental way that it would function would be worse for the region and worse for Kurdistan itself. Most of my rebuttal will be quite neatly interwoven. I think it clashes very clearly with what we've heard from Alex and the rest of the Gov bench. So first, why is the creation of this state simply fundamentally disastrous? Because recognize that OG tries to dance around this straight out of like modeling. They're like, the best we can. The problem is they say the best we can because there's no good way to do it, Honorable Speaker. There simply are way too many problems in the way that you allocate lands and you draw borders when there are contentious ideas of sovereignty and ethnic rights to those particular areas and the resources that lie therein. So recognize when they tell you that the best we can is what they're going to operate with, there is no good outcome because there are areas of Kurdistan that have significantly mixed populations where there are significant questions about where those borders should be drawn. And there typically tends to be quite large incentives for these independent states to contest those boundaries. So recognize that the large problem is that Kurdistan has non-Kurd populations within what would be like a hypothetical Kurdistan, as well as Kurds live widely dispersed both throughout Iraq and the larger Middle East as well as Turkey, right? So what happens fundamentally with this? So recognize, Alex provides us, what happens with the relocation of Kurds? Alex gives us the wealthy Kurds quick fix. Like basically we're gonna have like a scholarship program and we're just gonna relocate all of the Kurds of the world into this new Kurdistan. This, besides being preposterous, doesn't actually deal with these central arguments about why people don't relocate. Recognize that it's not simply a matter of the barrier of money, but rather that people have established lives, they have communities, they have resources, they have jobs, they have training, they have linguistic and cultural differences. These are the reasons that largely there are many individuals, like the same way with the establishment of Israel didn't mean that all Jewish populations, which are not homogenous or necessarily shared culture or fundamental linguistic or economic traditions, weren't able to all assimilate in that way. So I think that this means that you fundamentally are going to have many people who choose not to relocate. So what happens to Kurds that don't move? We tell you that first of all the persecution is far worse. I think a unique warrant that we give you for things like places in Turkey is recognize that because this means there is a precedent of Western nations supporting an autonomous state for Kurdistan, this means that the PKK becomes an even greater threat, and any of the totalitarianism that they say that Erdogan is exhibiting now becomes triplefold when they recognize that the West is sympathetic to carving up their land, carving up their resources, and supporting them with the full might of NATO, the United States, and imperialism to say that this state will be established. So recognize this means you have more likelihood of violence against these individuals, more likelihood of restrictions on those rights. But I think that furthermore, you just get persecution that is far worse by individuals who now think that these people do not have a place here, that they are now violating the ethnic identity. Because recognize that the problem is when the West comes in and carves up the Middle East like they did so many times before, like they've done in so many regions, is it actually just reifies and recreates those same ethnic divisions that have become the basis of that violence. It says that these important divisions are important, they are the basis of statehood, and if you do not follow along with them, these people are fundamentally should go to their homelands, they don't deserve to be part of those areas. But what happens also to those who do move? Because recognize there's this idea that now basically what is now northern Iraq will become this perfect utopia for all of the Kurds of the world. Recognize that Kurdistan is neither big enough nor economically developed enough to support the massive influx that they think would be the best case scenario. If you think that basically all of the persecuted Kurds of the world should move into this area, this is not a region that is economically developed enough and will become even less developed when they start to suffer things like not having the agricultural exchange that they have that is necessary with the rest of Iraq because they're not going to be alienated and they're going to have hostility because of the fact that they have this hold over things like oil resources. Not at this time. But secondly, let's talk about why, even if you do successfully basically get everyone moved, also sorry, just the last thing under that is basically there are populations still within Kurdistan that are Muslim populations that are not of the Kurdish people. I think that then we basically have a new Palestine of people that have already established there, people that work within oil extraction, people that live within those areas. These are now the individuals who are trapped within a region where they either have to move or now become the victims of a new Kurdistan. Sure, at this point.
What place would better protect those religious and ethnic minorities you care about than a newly independent Kurdistan?
Like, why do you think that Kurdistan would have any interest in protecting minorities other than their own because of a nationalistic ethnic identity that they're now trying to create so they can perpetuate and have that security? Like, if the whole point is that they feel threatened by other minorities, or the other majorities within Iraq, if those groups are now minorities within what they claim is their land, they have only interest in hostility and violence against those individuals because those people are the ones that are most threatening to their national and ethnic identity. So, moving secondly, why even if you do create a successful state, why this fundamentally damages the region? I think that there's been like interesting discussion about the way that security functions, but no one's actually dealt with the warrants of why the Peshmerga is actually a useful force to the West, Iraq, or anyone else. So recognize that the warrant for this is look, it is true that the Peshmerga is more skilled, they're more able to do this. There are large swaths of northern Iraq that would have fallen to ISIS quite easily had it not been for the interaction of the Peshmerga and the ability to defend that. But why did the Peshmerga actually agree to actually participate in any of these military maneuvers at all? Recognize that there are several reasons. So first of all, they use things to benefit, they use benefits to the Kurds that are basically function as a carrot. So they say, look, if you're able to come and function and defend these particular areas, then we're going to be able to give you things like greater land, more preferential ability to have greater revenue sharing with oil. These sorts of controls are the exact reasons they actually continue to participate. But secondly, we tell you that they actually have a vested interest in the security of larger Iraq, because it is true that they rely on Baghdad, it is true that they are part of a larger state, and so there is some sense of like national unity in that they do need to defend that their state doesn't fall, because then any protections from the semi-autonomous region of Kurdistan fall away. Recognize that ISIS has no interest and would simply not venture into an independent Kurdistan, because they are secure and they aren't able to leverage the same ethnic divides that exist in the rest of northern Iraq, where they can use the Sunni-Shia divide to be able to leverage local communities and get people to surrender quite quickly and try and expand that caliphate. So what this means is that Kurdistan is not going to be affected by ISIS. So what motivation would they ever have to participate, and what motivation would the Peshmerga ever have to actually be an ally against ISIS with the West taken out?
Given all the reasons you've given me to suggest that this new state would likely be a useful ally to Turkey, do you think Turkey is likely to take reactionary measures against its own Kurds, potentially souring relations with a new state that would be useful?
I don't think that we said that this would be useful to Turkey at all. I think that rather this serves as a threat because they're not going to leave Turkey because of all the reasons that I gave you. They're just going to continue to rally for the West to support another autonomous state within Turkey and within those regions, which would mean that we're much more likely to be have animosity. But recognize now that the suggestion is basically that we should use the Peshmerga as this now was breaching sovereignty, that they're not even battling within a state that is with their own, that the West should basically encourage Kurds to venture into parts of Iraq that are being threatened by ISIS, fight for a country is not their own, doesn't support them, and gives them no particular benefits, and something that's probably likely also to anger Iraq, given they're now going to have increased hostility. Because how does this also create greater ethnic conflict? Because recognize that when the West divides these up, it just reifies and amplifies these differences. Because now there's resentment and conflict over land. They're okay with Kurdistan existing under Iraqi sovereignty semi-autonomously, but they're unwilling to cede this control completely. Look at Israel and incursions from places like Lebanon, Iran, and the way that they've contested areas and borders there. Secondly, there's resentment over resources. We told you they're going to lose this preferential oil treatment. I think this fundamentally is going to be something now that they want to reclaim, and they're far more likely to have animosity rather than collaboration. And third, all of this links to the animosity we tell you is created when you have ethnic conflicts about violence within those communities. It means those states become scapegoats and they become seen as violent outsiders. Very proud of those.
I think the member of the opposition, and the member of the case today.
So it appears that we all agree that there are some goals that we ought to achieve, but Alex has told you that the only way to achieve those goals is to eradicate the barriers that exist in the long term and actually solve the problems that will continue to be present in the long run. So first, what is the biggest short-term problem? We told you that it is impossible to create stability or actually the possibility of peace and protection of rights for people when there are radical movements, particularly ISIS, that cause disruption in the area, that cause continual conflict, and not just conflict for the Kurds, but actually conflict for all of these other countries that actually instigate more kinds of oppression, more kinds of prejudice against not only ISIS, but all the people that the West associates them with. What is the problem? We told you that the Peshmerga are uniquely actually effective in this particular area because of the experience that they have and because of their demonstrated willingness to participate. They tell us that the only incentive they currently have is actually the kinds of incentives that the Iraqi government can offer them, kinds of things like land or participation. But there's no reason that the West wouldn't actually be able to offer these incentives as well. There's no reason, once they have a nation, that they wouldn't want to also protect that nation as they currently do, but also that they wouldn't be able to better support this. But the problem is the West is currently already engaging in this kind of support. The West is already currently looking for an actor to support in this area, we told you. But Alex tells you that there are actually two barriers to that not giving Kurds an independent state presents. One of them is they're unable to effectively incentivize the Kurds because they're unable to reach the record. But two, actually, that they have, in order to do so, they have to facilitate other actors who do worse things, that actively convolute the situation in the area. That in order to actually provide arms or provide money to the Peshmerga, they have to support corrupt governments, they have to support actors that are not accountable, they have to actually support other actors that actively are bad. So we tell you that actually it is vital to have more actors, particularly that have not had a history of conflict with other people, that have not had a history of committing atrocities. And we also tell you that this is actually vital to have this sort of thing and solve this problem first. Sure.
So, firstly, we know that largely gains versus ISIS are due almost entirely to Western airstrikes. But to the extent to which you want the new Kurdish military to be the vanguard of push against ISIS, how do you think Iraq reacts to Kurdish fighters taking Sunni Iraqi land?
So there's no reason that they would be taking Sunni Iraqi land. But we also tell you that actually what is the case is that regardless of the efficacy that the US currently, the West currently has, that there are areas they cannot protect, or that areas where they need to cooperate with locals, and there's no reason that this wouldn't be a good action on overall. But furthermore, we tell you there's actually why is this actually going to lead to long-term stability? Because ISIS is not the only conflict, although they create conflict. We tell you, actually, the idea, the conflict between Kurds and other bodies that oppress them are going to be a continuous conflict, and that there needs to be a problem. Mostly what we get out of opposition is this. One, they never prove a method of improvement on their side of the house. We told you, given that they are going to be minorities in the present and in the future, that actually the Shia majority is going to continuously oppress them, that the kinds of activity that in sight are actually, one, directly harmful, but two, also going to be continuously inefficacious. We see no reason as to why not to create a venue of change. They never told us why we ought to preference the people who don't, the Kurds who don't support change over the Kurds who actually deserve a venue to create a better state.
The West is currently armed the Peshmerga and been quite effective at it. Why are the marginal benefits in your extension a reason good enough to create a whole new nation state? Why can't we just arm them as we do currently?
So it seems that if there are benefits, however small, over your benefits, however not present, that there would still be a reason to do this. But we also told you that the kinds of conflicts you say would be engendered actually are already endemic in the situation that provides. It is simply a method of advocating for which kind of actor that we ought to, which kind of Kurd state that we ought to advocate for. We get out of closing that actually this is just impossible to kind of adjudicate, that we don't know how to create a Kurd state. So the answer is simple. In the areas where they are providing, they already have effective control, where they already have a civil service, where they're effectively self-governing, we would pick those areas. The other areas would not be up for discussion at the present moment. But we tell you that we ought to preference those Kurds who are in support of creating a state where they would actually advocate for the lessening of oppression of themselves over those Kurds who may have other incentives. We tell you right now, there's no avenue for any of them, and this is actually why it is the most important. They tell us that actually what's going to happen is that they're simply going to, I don't have the time for this anymore, that actually what's going to happen is that they're simply going to oppress they're going to create another kind of state in which there's going to be more oppression. But this is simply untrue. Historically, the Kurds have protected other minorities, like Christians, but also we tell you the Kurds would have an active incentive to create a state that is possible. But furthermore, the comparison is simply to create a state and maintain control within that, and not create incentives if they are such a state that is so small and doesn't need additional distress in order to create oppression that would engender that kind of conflict. But furthermore, we tell you the comparison is simply a state in which Kurds are continuously oppressed, the kinds of various states. But furthermore, what the solution to this, the best solution to this, is actually particularly here, because recognize that actually in other areas where Kurds are present, what the problem is that those areas are much more oppressive and they're much less able to self-govern. What we get out of closing is that actually what's going to happen is that this kind of nation is going to be far worse because they're going to be overwhelmed by the massive influx of Kurds and not be able to support themselves. So I think this is a mischaracterization of where Kurds are. 85% of Kurds are already in the areas that they effectively are able to control, and this would be the most important thing. But finally, we tell you this is actually going to decrease long-term unrest in the other surrounding areas, which is a thing that we ought to value. Why is this the case? Because the reason that they oppress the Kurds are not simply because of racial conflicts, are not simply because of ethnic historical hatred. We tell you that the reason is because they actually find that these groups may pose a threat to public support. They may pose a threat to the government. And the more that they are in those areas, the more that those governments actually focus on this, and the more that it takes away from the short-term and long-term goals of peace and stability in the region. For all of these reasons.
I think the government went for her speech and invite the opposition whip to conclude the debate.
The government whip tells us that it is our burden to show you the way in which we will allow the Kurdish people to eventually realize their full national identity. But I think rather the burden on government is to show you that there are clear benefits and delineations to both the Kurdish people and the surrounding region as a result of granting them this autonomous state. I think the problem with the entire government bench has been that they have solely focused upon the Kurdish people and the way in which the Kurdish people will interact with this, rather than the larger harms to the region as a result of creating this actual separate state. I think there are very clear harms to the region, and I think these harms vastly outweigh any minimal nationalist rhetoric that the Kurdish people can gain as a result of having slightly more sovereignty than they do currently. So 3 arguments in this speech, or 3 topic areas. So first about the conflicts over resource ownership, second the harms to Iraq that are delineated as a result of this, and third the harms to Kurds that actually occur as a result of creating a separate Kurdish state. So first on the conflicts over resource ownership. I think there are actually very clear conflicts over this. So one of the reasons in which Iraq has had such control over the Kurdish people is because they recognize that there are massive oil revenues that are generated by the Kurdish people. So what does this mean in terms of creating a separate Kurdistan? It means that Iraq has massive incentives to keep Kurdish people within its borders as a result of the oil revenue that is generated by them. The reason they have this incentive is because without the Kurdish people, they have very limited economic ability to actually interact on the global stage as a result of the lack of oil revenue that is generated from larger Iraq. So what this means is that Iraq feels extremely hostile towards Western intervention in order to create the separate Kurdistan. Because recall that the model we get out of OG is that this is Western intervention into Iraq in order to create a separate Kurdistan. What this means is that Iraq has very little incentive to actually cooperate with the West in terms of this separation, and has extremely high incentives to actually maintain control over these resources. But I think the very strange argument we also get from OG is that, well, they will just continue trading. So I think actually the way that trade will be used in this instance is as leverage to force Kurdistan to reintegrate into Iraq. So likely what will happen is that Iraq will withhold things like agricultural resources from Kurdistan in order to force Kurdistan to reintegrate into Iraq. So trade doesn't actually create mutual benefits to both nations, but rather is used as a tool with which to essentially starve out Kurdistan until it re-enters into Iraq. So what this means is that it actually limits the ability of Kurdistan to have later claims to sovereignty or later claims to actually being able to have a separate state, because they already have had one state which will likely fail very quickly as a result of the limited ability of Iraq to actually engage in trade with them. Sure.
On both sides of the House, the Iraqi government will want to control the oil fields. What do you do to prevent the future gassing of the Kurds and military reconquest of those areas?
So I think the problem is that the military reconquest will still happen in your world, but will be much worse as a result of the separate statehood of Kurdistan. So recognize that what this creates is a massive global conflict as a result of allies with both of these states, because the West will likely ally themselves with Kurdistan, which means that there will be a very toxic and hostile relationship between much of the Middle East, which will likely ally itself with Iraq as a result of the Muslim majority within Iraq, and likely cause actually much larger conflicts that would spill over into other nations. So I think that on both sides of the house you will have this kind of conflict, but I think on their side of the house it gets much worse as a result of the larger systemic harms of that conflict. So, but then also I think that conflict exacerbation just leads to targeting of Kurdish people and actually does cause huger conflicts. But then the second argument I want to talk about is how this is harmful to Iraq. So recognize that the greatest threat actually facing Iraq right now is ISIS intervention within Iraq and the foment of unrest as a result of ISIS. So what has actually allowed them to limit that is the presence of Kurdish peoples within the state. I think it is massively damaging to the government bench for them not to engage with this argument and the real threat that ISIS poses as a result of taking Iraq. Because recognize that one of the biggest arguments that ISIS makes is about its land claims and its ability to actually control those swaths of land. So when Kurdistan is created, it means that you no longer have military ability to fight off ISIS within larger Iraq. Recognize also that Kurdistan would have very little incentive to actually cooperate in any degree with Iraq. Recognize also there are sovereignty limitations to Kurdistan cooperating, but also given they feel that they have been oppressed in many instances, there's no incentive for them to intervene militarily. But also when Iraq loses any sort of economic ability to be stable, it means that ISIS can prey off of that economic instability and the statehood instability. There's just inherent instability that comes with splitting up states, and that splitting up of the state allows for the very conditions by which ISIS can enter into Iraq and cause greater civil unrest and actually have ability to gain a foothold. No. So I think the actual harm here is very clear to Iraq, which means that the Iraqi people are hurt as a result of the intervention in ISIS, which also has larger spillover spillover harms as a result of ISIS moving farther east and having the ability to gain larger footholds within this region. One of the ways we've actually been able to successfully combat them is by the Peshmerga. I think they have very little incentive to actually engage on their side of the house. But also recognize that this is harmful to minorities living within Kurdistan. I think it is insane for closing government to say that minorities within Kurdistan are never actually hurt by the Kurds. I think actually that what Taylor tells you very clearly out of her extension is that oftentimes the Kurdish people are targeted, or Kurdish people target other minorities within the state because they recognize that though they are a majority in larger Iraq, they constitute a minority within that state and therefore are targeted as a result of the Kurdish people enacting certain feelings of oppression upon those people who they feel they can oppress. So I think there are actually very clear harms as a result of this. I'll actually take opening.
The threat militarily to Kurdistan from Iraq is not huge. Iraq is hugely dependent on the West. Kurdistan has military superiority. The bigger threat is the political scale back of rights that is possible in a world in which Kurdish rights are contingent upon the political whims of the central government in Baghdad that is not aligned in their interests.
So I think here's the huge problem. So I think first that the Kurdish people, if they do get this state, are likely going to face scalebacks within places like Turkey and within places like Iraq, which means that those who cannot immigrate to the state are hurt. But second, I tell you that even if they do have some degree of rights, the economic devastation that Kurdistan faces as a result of being independent actually means that these rights are relatively name-based only and don't actually play out on the ground because of the lack of actual infrastructure that they have to economically be self-sufficient and have ownership over those claims. So third, harmful to Kurds. So recognize that the huge harm to ethnic Kurds who are living outside of Iraq is massive. The reason that Turkey will start to target groups like the PKK even more is because the West has a precedent of actually establishing autonomous states for the Kurdish people. Taylor brings that clearly out of extension and I think actually wins closing opposition the round. Because the reason you actually see huge harms to Kurdish people who are living outside of Kurdistan is the fear that they too will create separatist movements that actually do limit the ability of those states to be autonomous. I think also the other problem to the Kurdish people is they are just unable to migrate and start to feel like transient individuals within the states that they are living in. So one of the hugest harms to Jewish peoples as a result of the creation of Israel was feeling that they no longer had a home within the state that they resided in because of the existence of Israel and that they ought to move back. This is a huge harm to individuals who are unable to migrate. It's not just about wealth, Alex. But I think also the problem is that within Kurdistan, these individuals do not have the agricultural resources to actually have self-sufficiency and are dependent on Iraq, and this is why separatist movements have not been successful historically. For these reasons, proud to oppose.